Welcome to the Tier 2 training on produce safety, brought to you by the New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association with support from La Moñtanita Cooperative and the Wallace Center at Winrock International. In this series of training modules, which are designed to support the New Mexico Tier 1 and Tier 2 on-farm and classroom trainings, we discuss how to conduct a thorough food safety risk assessment of your farm.
We begin with the land you grow on, its history, how you are using it now, and the soil amendments and chemicals that you use to build soil and feed and protect your crops. A farm map is a useful tool to help you think through and identify how you are using your land and buildings. It can show the location of key features such as growing areas, compost and chemical storage, water sources and permanent fixtures like hydrants and headers, toilets, hand washing facilities, buildings and their uses, and wherever you have livestock. Make it large enough to show the properties and features that surround your farm. It may help to show topography, what's uphill and what's downhill. And if your crops are at risk from manure spray or dust drift, you can indicate prevailing winds and any natural protection such as hedgerows or swales. Now put on your food safety lenses. Think about your land use and inputs and how crops may be vulnerable to biological, chemical, or physical hazards. Start by thinking about the land you're growing your crops on now. In the last 5 years, what was that land used for? If it's been in use as cropland for 5 or more years, it's likely there are no food safety problems. What are the potential hazards in these particular examples? The chicken trailer and composting toilet may be a source of biological contaminants from raw manure. Junk piles, which are very common on farms, can be a source of chemical contaminants from old fuel tanks, machine parts, or chemical drugs, and physical contaminants such as broken plastic, wood, metal, or glass. Next, you want to think about what's uphill and what's next door. I've seen fuel tanks set up right next to strawberry fields without any thought to what will happen if there is a spill. And this is a particularly bad example of manure runoff, but you get the idea. Woods all around crops could mean you have more wildlife intrusion. It's a good idea before you plant to observe wildlife traffic. It's also possible that woods will provide food and habitat for critters that might otherwise want to feast on your lettuce. How about your current land use besides crops? Are crops located a safe distance from sources of raw manure, from runoff, leaching, or drift? Are there fences or vegetative buffers to protect crop growing areas? Are you sharing equipment, walkways, and driving lanes with livestock? Wheels, clothing, feet, and water splashed from puddles can all be a source of contamination if you're not thoughtful. Is there any way to avoid cross-contamination from these sources?
And the surrounding, we have a pretty good barrier with what we have going on as far as the tree lines are concerned. We didn't have much in the way of runoff. We did have to change a few things down closer to the farm. We had manure at the start when I started. We had mushroom soil. We had the compost. So we did have to kind of look at that from a different perspective with the rules and regulations of FSMA. So we did move the chicken manure to a location on the bottom of the farm.
So it was downhill from all the crops.
So it was downhill, and any kind of runoff was eliminated into any of the fields. We also eliminated the tractors running through that and then cross-contaminating into the fields.
So that's a really important point, that you don't have vehicles and people's feet going through areas that might have raw manure or uncomposted raw manure.
And it's not something you think of. So, you know, you're in your daily activities, and as you're doing your daily activities, you know, you're running the tractors through, you're running the golf cart through, people are walking to dump canisters, and you don't realize that then you're walking back into, you know, the pack house where there's food production going on. So these are all things that,
Are you or your neighbors using and or storing raw manure? If you are, where is it located? Is there any risk from runoff into crops, farm lanes, or farmyards? Is the application process a risk to neighboring crops? Do you need to talk to your neighbor about when and where they apply raw manure close to your crops? If you do use raw manure, to reduce risk, you can follow National Organic Program requirements. This means that you apply the raw manure and work it into the soil no less than 2 weeks before planting and at least 120 days before harvest, where the crop touches the ground, or 90 days before harvest, where the crop doesn't touch the ground. For the purposes of food safety, there are 2 categories of compost. Compost that is treated passively, and compost that is treated using a scientifically valid process, such as that required by the National Organic Program requirements. If you use passively treated compost that contains animal manure, you should proceed as if the manure is raw. Scientifically treated compost, on the other hand, may be applied with no restrictions, but you do have to keep records to prove that it's scientifically valid. Is there a risk of cross-contamination when you handle raw or incompletely composted manure? Are you safely handling soil amendments, both treated and untreated? Do you have dedicated equipment, clothing, and shoes or boots for when you work with manure? Are you paying attention when you move between unfinished compost and finished compost? Are you using the same pitchfork for both? Don't let this discourage you. Soil rich in microbial diversity will increase competition with human and plant pathogens and very likely help reduce pathogens in the farming environment. Next, we talk about human waste. Is your human waste management system in good condition? Is anyone monitoring this? Is it a safe distance from water sources, crops, and food handling areas? And do you have a procedure in place if you have a leak or a spill? Is there any risk of flooding during heavy rains? Floods can spread contaminants of all kinds, and you may need to quarantine an area and do soil tests if the problem is serious. Standing water from heavy rainfall that pools on the surface of saturated soils is not technically flooding. But if it's a chronic problem, it could still be a catchment area for pathogens, particularly if you have animals hanging out in it or walking through it. Are your chemicals stored safely? Are you using regulated chemicals that require an applicator to be trained and licensed? Do you follow the labeled instructions, and do you keep records of all your chemical applications? Do you know if the source of the water used for mixing chemicals for spraying is of adequate quality? And we'll talk more about this later. What's your procedure for cleaning spray tanks? Do you do this safely away from growing areas and from equipment? And how do you dispose of any leftover chemicals or chemical packaging? So after you've identified potential hazards, think about what actually poses a significant risk and what is fine just as it is. Is there anything already in place to reduce risk? Use your finite resources where they are most needed. And keep in mind that on-farm food safety is a process of continuous improvement, not immediate perfection.